episode of Green Thumbs and Good Vibes, your podcast all about gardening and cultivating fruits and vegetables and the sustainable lifestyle that comes along with it. As always, we're your hosts, Colin and Mitchell, and we're so excited that you joined us today. Today's topic, we're going to try to break down composting for you, make it an easy thing to understand, give you a rundown of your different options and what might be a sort of advantage or a benefit or a negative, of each one of those things, so that you can decide what sort of lineup of things would work best for you. So, as always, grab your cup of coffee, sit back, get ready to enjoy this episode on composting. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So as far as composting goes, you're going to have just a few major options for your main setup. And then we'll kind of talk about some things that you can add to this setup. You can kind of add multiple stages and things like that. And we'll talk about all of those options. But here are your major categories when it comes to composting. You can either do like an on-the-ground composting. You'll see a lot of these kind of some squares, these little bays set up with these large piles in it that will then be transferred into like another bay eventually and going on down the line till the finished product. You also have you can do it in some sort of container, a barrel or a large, kind of structure that is easy to cover, is all contained. And when it is finished, then, you might be able to pour that out into something or just a little bit easier handling on that one. There's also the tumbling composter option, which is sort of that, if you imagine it in a barrel, that last option, we turn that barrel on its side and we are able then to kind of spin that to tumble then the compost, as opposed to turning it with something like, a shovel or something like that, doing that manually. Well, it is still manually, but, just a much, much easier process. And then nowadays, there's some indoor composting options as well. So we'll talk about those. There's also, let's talk about some of those cursory things now before we move on to kind of the nuts and bolts of it. There's also something called a worm bin. These are worm powered, let's say, composting setups, right? And this will produce something, if you've seen this, sometimes they sell it at a nursery, called worm castings. That's what that is, right? It's that dirt that's been through a worm. And then, we also recommend planning as part of your composting setup something that's going to live in the kitchen, right? In the kitchen, so that as you're cooking, as you're chopping things up, you can take those food scraps and go ahead and put them into something that eventually will make its way down to the compost. Because the truth is, none of us are going to, every time we cut an onion and peel it, instead of walking to the trash can, walk outside to our compost. That's just not going to happen. So we want something that's kind of the middleman there so that we can bring large amounts out to the compost pile. So I'm going to turn it over to Mitchell now, just to give you kind of a rundown of like what is composting and how to get started if it's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, I'm pretty lazy. I go out about once a week. I'll store everything and then just go out there and throw it all into the compost.
Yep. That's me too, about once a week.
Yeah, so basically composting, you're taking, organic material like food scraps, weeds, dead plants, and you're putting it all together, and there's microbes in there that start to break down the organic material, and it breaks it down so much to a point to where the plants can actually use it as like a type of soil. It's, compost. So helps them grow. They can pull up those nutrients. So it's really cool reusing stuff from your kitchen, from your yard, and nothing's going to waste really. So to start composting, Colin talked about the containers. To start, the most easiest ratio, they talk about greens and browns in composting. So your greens is stuff that's still alive or was just recently pulled up from the ground. And then your browns is stuff that's been dead for a little bit longer. Or also browns can just be like stems of a thicker plant. And then greens could be the leaves of the plant. So some people say a little more greens, or some people say a little more browns, but the easiest way is just to think half greens, half browns, and then it should work perfect from there. We also like to add a little bit of soil to our compost just to get that process started. If you're only adding in leaves and stems, there's not many microbes there to start the composting process. So just, you don't need to add in a whole bag of soil, but if you have like a plant pot from last year where you never dumped out the soil, you could just dump that in there. I think you could also just grab soil from the ground, Colin, like just with a shovel. Would that work as well? I mean, it's not
Yeah, for
perfect,
sure.
but
I think it would. Anything that's kind of been outside, been exposed to the elements, and might have like a worm or two in it, might have a couple, of those kind of beneficial bugs and
hmm,
like microbial life, like you were talking about.
that's true. Yeah, I didn't even think of it. Probably getting worms in there would be a great option. If you have a
For
plant
sure.
pot, it's probably not going to have worms. Okay. And you want to definitely, when you first start it, give it a really nice soak of water. The microbes need kind of like a moist environment to do their work. Although you don't want it too wet. I guess to start you can keep it wet, but we'll get into kind of how to maintain it here in a second. And you want to make sure it has proper airflow, so don't have it. I don't think you should have it completely covered up, right?
Mm-mm.
So that you need
No,
some
yeah.
type of for it to breathe, basically.
Yep,
'Cause it's
absolutely.
like yeah, it's like a live organism. And when we're adding our greens, for example, try not to add. You can definitely add weeds like around the yard. That's a great green to use, and you have to do something with it anyways. You're going to be pulling it. But if that weed has seeds on it, we don't really recommend you to throw that into the compost. In a best case scenario, if you did, the compost gets hot enough to where it kills a lot of the weed seeds, so you'll never see them again. However, it's a little unlikely probably to kill every single weed seed. So if you start using that compost and putting it around your yard, those weed seeds are going to come right up like in your flower bed or your veggie bed, and you don't want that. And as well, I wouldn't really recommend putting thorny plants into the compost, like a blackberry cane, raspberries, anything like that. Because you're going to be eventually you're going to be grabbing the compost, putting it wherever, or if you're turning it, your hand might stick in there for a second. You just don't want to get cut up. As well, along those lines, I wouldn't add probably like poison ivy in there or anything that can give you a rash. It's just not worth it to put in the compost. You'll find plenty of other stuff that'll be suitable for the compost. But I think that's about it to start it and kind of the things to add. But Colin, if there's anything you want to add, or you can just go into how to start maintaining that.
Yeah, I think you really covered it well. So, if we're going to start maintaining our compost, the first thing is making sure that that mix is right and you have a good start. So, once you have that good start, here's some different options. So I'm going to kind of talk through all the different things that we talked about at the beginning, like how you could be doing this. Do you have the ground method? Do you have, and then we're going to talk about kind of some of the maintenance tips for each one of them. So if you have the on the ground method, let's call it, where you have some bays or something like that, you're going to want to be turning that, which will have to be with a shovel. One of the disadvantages, right? You're going to have to do it in a very manual way, where if you have a second bay, that would be nice. You can just take it, put it into the second bay, and then that will turn it, right? So that's one of the options. If you just have one bay, which was I had that set up at one point, it is a little bit more tough. You're gonna be putting the shovel in and turning it on itself many times, and that's probably the most lengthy way to go about it, but it does work. So we recommend turning your compost at least once a week. We do it every 3 days. Now we have the tumbling composter, so that makes it really easy. But here's sort
Mm-hmm.
of a rule of thumb. There, it does need to have some breaks in between the turning. You don't want to be turning it every day, but as the the more that you can kind of let the microbial life, the even the fungal life take over a bit, and then mix it in, the faster the process is going to happen, as opposed to just leaving it in a pile and never touching it. that process is going to be much, much slower. Okay. So that's how you would handle the on the ground composting. If you have a barrel or a tumbling composter, then you'll make it much easier on yourself to turn that thing every 3 days. Along with
Mm-hmm.
turning it, you want to make sure that you're giving it enough water, and that in the turning process, right, it's getting some air. So, whether that means like our tumbling composters have holes in them to make sure that air happens, right? A lot of people, if they make bays, they leave slats in between the wood so that there's a little airflow. Okay. So that's something to think about. Now, we're talking here about warm climate. In the winter, when it's getting really cold, a lot of people, and I would recommend this, take a tarp or something, cover that compost to try to keep some of the warmth in and keep that decomposition happening for as long as possible. So, just to clarify here, this is, in the part of the year that isn't freezing, basically. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, other than that, maintenance is pretty easy. So, here are a couple other things with maintenance. You might want to get a big pile together and have that start aging and you're turning that, but that really shouldn't be the same pile that you're going out every week and emptying your food scraps into. There should be sort of an addition part of your compost setup, ideally, and an aging part of your compost setup. Now, the easiest way to do this is, once again, the tumbling composters. I think we're both a little biased towards those,
Mm-hmm.
but mine, I
So
know,
easy.
has, and Mitchell's too, have two chambers, right? So split in half, this barrel. So one chamber I filled to about 60, 75% full of the browns and the greens, make sure it's ample water, getting some air in there. And then I am adding to the other side until I reach that level. But in the meantime, it's always turning. Both sides are turning when I turn the barrel, right? So we're getting the decomposition started in the addition side, while the
Mm-hmm.
aging side of the barrel is continuing to be turned and just break down, without the addition of anything like fresh that would have to kind of start that timeline over again. And speaking of the timeline, I'm just going to go ahead and just touch on these other two here. We're talking about in ideal scenarios. So here's what ideal means. All of your stuff that you're adding to the compost is like wood chip size or smaller. So it's chopped up, it's pretty uniform. It's
Mm-hmm.
perfectly moist. It's getting a perfect amount of air, right? And it's being turned often. Okay, in that case, we're talking about as soon as a 2-month time frame to be able to use that, going to about, on the long end, maybe 6 months if you're not turning it as much or whatever. But if you think about it, that's about a season for most people, is in that time frame. Anywhere from like 3 to 5 months is usually how long a season lasts, right? So while you've got your garden set up and going, you're decomposing, right? And then once you're able to use it, guess what? You get all these new plants to start the process over again. And so that's how kind of the garden and the compost work together. And here are a few things to look at. So that's an idea. Now you have the whole timeline in mind, right? Here's how I start. Here's what it looks like in the middle and what I do during the aging process and how I know it's finished. So I'm just going to give you a few signs to look for. Okay. How do I know I'm doing it right? Right. How do I know if it's really working? Well, if you see some steam coming off of the compost, right? Maybe you're turning it, you're digging your shovel in or whatever manner, right? And that little steam comes out. Okay, now we know it's getting hot. That's a good sign. Okay, if you're seeing worm activity, if you're seeing some bug activity around and in the compost when you're turning it, that can be a good sign. Okay, and as it heats up, that will die down a little bit, right? In the very hot parts, which is okay. And then the color is going to start to change. Obviously, you're putting browns in, dead things that probably are the color brown. You're putting greens in, and those can be, mostly green, but also different colors and things like that. But it will kind of homogenize into a very dark brown or even sometimes a black color. And once it starts to get that color, that's also a good sign. So look for those signs of 4 or 5. Yes. Okay. That's a good point. If there is an issue with your compost, you're not getting it to break down, it's not really getting hot for you, you're not seeing what you want to see, it could be that your mix is messed up or you're missing another thing like air or water, right? But that 50
Mm-hmm.
50 mix browns and greens, you could be off on one. If it kind of looks sloppy, you're probably off on the browns. If it looks too dry, kind of like mulch or something like that, it's not really breaking down into the fine particulate, then you might need a little bit more greens. Or if you're having trouble keeping it wet, you might need a little bit more greens. Okay, so there are some good tips for you and kind of a look on the maintenance process. So anything
Mm-hmm.
you need to or you feel to add to that, Mitchell? Anything I missed on that one?
I think you covered it very well. Yeah, I'll just highlight whenever you are adding stuff, make sure you are cutting it up, like Colin said. I added stuff to one side, like some kind of like some big twigs, but checking in on them like a month later, they look the same. They did
Yeah,
not
yeah.
much change because they're just, I don't know, they were well over a foot long. So yeah, cut things up as much as you can, and even the weeds when you're adding them in there, I would just pull weeds and throw them straight in, but if you could shred those up a little bit, it's gonna like at least double the speed of the process. And then just so Colin really covered what to look for, how you know when you're done. And then once you think you have a good looking compost, like Colin said, make sure you're not adding more stuff to it. If you keep adding to it, it's whenever you want to use it, you're still going to have like, full food scraps in there, and you don't want to put that in the garden. It's going to cause animals and who knows what to get into your garden. But once you have a really nice consistency, it's, hot, it's very dark color, we like to spread it along like flower beds, for example, or veggie beds. For sure, whenever you're starting like a raised garden bed, be a very good, somewhat top layer, or that you can mix into the soil whenever you're making a raised garden bed. Basically, the compost is just a very, very nutritiously dense type of material that the plants can grab so many different types of nutrients from. And then also when you're planting large plants like trees, for example, stuff that you have to dig out a really big hole for, whenever you fill it back in, you can do, what do you think, Colin, like a 50-50 of soil and compost? I
Yeah.
don't think, probably not like a full, yeah, I wouldn't use only compost because it doesn't really have the specific stuff that roots can grow onto well. It wouldn't be too bad probably, but
You might have some
soil,
issues with drainage. That's the only thing. Like
yeah.
you got a lot
Oh,
of organic material. It's going to hold on to water. Some trees are cool with that. Like citrus, for instance, it likes well draining soil. So just depends on what you have. Do your research. But a 50-50 mix is going to work probably most of the time.
yep. Yeah, the soil needs those little rocks that the soil naturally has for, yeah, to help drainage a bit. And then seedlings as well could be a good option to use your compost. But we recommend sifting it first, just in case there's any still big, wood chips in there or whatnot, or big twigs. You don't want those with your seedlings when they're trying to come up. But really, and I think that's about it for what to do with the compost. We'll get into it a little bit more, kind of about why composting as well, and Colin can get into that.
Yeah. So that was really great. Basically compost is your all in one. Whatever you feel like, this could be a little higher nutrition. It's basically your amendment for the garden that you can use anywhere, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's one reason why you compost, but there's also many other reasons, right? So with the concern about the environment and everyone's personal environmental impact, this composting specifically can be one of the things that helps kind of take away some of your personal impact, because now one thing we should have said, your compost is vegetarian. You're not putting bones in there. You're not putting, oils or fats, anything like that. What you are putting in is your vegetable food scraps, and that's mainly it. Fruit, food scraps as well, anything vegetarian, right? So okay, great. Yeah, you can add eggs. That's why we say that. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so you're doing that. So now all of those things that I just mentioned, you are removing from your impact or add to the landfill. So your garbage man is no longer picking up all of these food scraps and they're going to a landfill. You are taking care of that and actually recycling it into a highly nutrient dense, very very useful material that you're able to then grow your food in the next year. So less of your stuff is going to waste, right? Also, you're going to have healthier plants because what you're doing is you're taking plants, right, to make the soil to feed the plants. So, why is that important? Well, the plants have already, when they've grown the first time, sequestered the perfect nutrient kind of makeup for themselves to grow. They are made of exactly what they need to grow, is the way to say that. So when we chop that up and when we kind of condense that down, decompose that down into a concentrate, which is the compost, right? Now we take it and it is just the perfect sort of, what am I trying to say? Like proportion of these things that the plant
Mm-hmm.
needs to grow. So healthier plants at the end of the day, right? Everybody wants that. It's also, once you get started in gardening, right, and get started with the initial investment of compost supplies, it can end up saving you money because what you're doing is you're taking all your old plants and making, and also some of the things that you're buying at the store, I'm sure, right, and scrapping in there that you don't grow, and you're making all of that into soil for next year. So it's just that much. Every single piece of food scrap that you put in there is one less, little bit of soil you have to buy next year, basically. So if you're really consistent on this and you really want to make sure, all of our food scraps are going into the compost, you can really have a good amount of this high quality stuff next, even as soon as next season, to use on your plants, and definitely by this time next year you'll have quite a bit, right? So that's another great option. Save a little money, and also not only are we keeping those food things out of the landfill, but as Mitchell said, we're using weeds, we're using some yard waste, let's just call it. They can even be, if you have a chipper, you can take some trimmings, some tree trimmings, chip that up into a very fine chip, and then use that as your brown, right? That's great. So, all of those then yard waste materials are also not going to the landfill, right? Even then, further um, kind of taking away that impact that you're making on the environment. So, along with just having this excellent material that you've made yourself, and that's fun, right? There are all these other additional benefits to why to compost. So, um, it really is a powerful method to use.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just say too, uh, be a little careful about how much of certain things you put in there. So, just as an example, I was looking up the other day, like I put in coffee grounds, the little strainer for it, the filter, and the grounds themselves. They're both compostable, but you don't want to put more than you don't want your compost to be made up of more than like 15 to 20% in total volume of just coffee grounds, because coffee grounds themselves are very acidic. So that's gonna very change the pH of the compost, and when you put it on plants, it could possibly damage the plant if it's just too acidic in itself. So just be a little careful about what exactly you're putting in. But yeah, like Colin was saying, I'll do eggs, the eggshell, and then also certain egg cartons you buy, the carton itself is also compostable. So if you can buy that kind, then it's like a 2-in-1. And besides that, yeah, just mostly food scraps is a good option. But I think we're good to get into our specific setups, what we like to do. So for myself right now, I have, like Colin was saying, a pretty big tumbler system where it has 2 slots. So like Colin said, I'll put one full side, I'll fill completely up, and then I'll try not to touch it for like 2 months while the whole system's going. And then while that one is full, And when I say full, probably about 75% or so. You don't want to fill it completely up because it does need that airflow when you're tumbling. It needs to be able to shift around. And then also you need to be able to open it up. And if I filled it 100%, some would fall out every single time I open it up.
Yeah.
And then so the other side, that's where I'm adding in new material, slowly building it up. And since it's the one that I have, I probably most work this way. When you turn one side, the other side's going to turn too. So that other side's just getting a head start on the compost, even though it's not completely full to begin with. And then when I do water them, I will water them both, or I'll at least check both of them. But usually, if one's dry, the other one's going to be dry as well, just because of the temperature. And I've done, before I had the tumbler, I was doing just on the ground system where you have at least two slots. So basically, one side's empty, one side's full. And then once it's time to turn it, you take it from one side and then move it to the other with a shovel. And that is a lot of work, I will say. I try to be efficient in what I do, and that's a lot of work. I'm too lazy.
Yeah.
So I would recommend the tumbling system 100%. It's kind of fun to go out there, every morning. Well, not every morning because you only want to turn it about every 3 days. If you turn it daily, the microbes aren't going to be able to dig in as deep into the greens and the browns as they can. If you give them a few days to really work on what they're currently sitting on, then you move them around, give them a few days to work on it. If you turn it every single day, it's not going to get as hot and as much activity as it would otherwise. So the tumblers are a little expensive, but you can find them for like $100-$200 maybe, I think, at the most. And you can if you want to spend some big money, there's also just really big tumblers that you can get online too. I think like over $1,000, but you don't need to go that crazy into it. I wouldn't recommend that to start for sure. But I think,
Yeah,
yeah, if you want to get
those
into
are really
yours.
cool. I have seen one of those in person, one of those giant tumblers. It has like a big crank on it. It's awesome.
Yeah, yeah, it's fun to. Yeah, mine has that crank. I love cranking it. I don't know, like in the
Yeah,
morning
it's
when
fun.
it's time to do it, it's just such. It's really satisfying.
Mine has like little. I almost call them like rock climber grips. It's like little divots in the barrel that you like dig into and spin it that way. So you're
Oh, that's
kind of
cool.
spinning it with the fingers. Yeah, so it doesn't have a
Yeah.
crank on the side. I could add one though, for sure, if I
Oh,
wanted
yeah.
to.
I do the crank.
Cool. Well, my
So.
setup, it's basically I think of it as like a three-parter. So I do have a little thing inside. It's like a little stainless steel container with a carbon filter in it. So, if, like I said, if I'm putting something in there on Monday, but I'm not going out there till Friday, then, it's not going to stink up my whole house, basically. So,
Mhm.
um, and I haven't had any problems with smell. Definitely, I would think into that, getting something that's totally sealed or getting something with a little filter in it. And then once I take that, I'll chop it up and then I'll add it to the tumbler, like I said. Now my tumbler also has two sides. I do the same method, right? One is aging, one is adding. And then here's the deal. So once the aging one is done, dump that out. That then becomes the new additioning or adding, sorry, side. And so, then that means that the one I was adding to becomes the aging side. And I then take that finished product. And if I'm not ready to use it, I do then have a large, it's like a plastic um, container. It doesn't have a bottom, but it does have a top lid. So I can cover it if it's raining or something like that. So it doesn't get too wet. And I then add that product to the large container. Another thing I use the large container for is like, the weed example is great. So I just pulled a bunch of weeds from my backyard, right? If I were to chop that up, I could fill an entire side of my composter with just the greens from those weeds, right? That's not good.
Mhm.
So then what I'll do is I'll add that to the large compost, right? I'll add that in. It's already inoculated with finished compost that I've added, right? And then I can add the browns in too. I would only recommend this if you know you're not going to use the compost for a while, so that has time once again to age. But it is good for that. Like if you all of a sudden get a large influx of material and your tumbler and composter's full, you do have an option to go put it somewhere else.
Mm.
So I think of that as like a lasagna, like a layer of finished compost. Then I might have a layer of browns and greens with another layer of finished compost on top, So
Is that stored in like a barrel or something, or what do you put
it's
that
like
in?
it's like a plastic box without a bottom, basically. And it's sort of wider
Mm.
at the bottom than it is the top. And it has, vents in it and all that for the air. So it works pretty
Yeah,
well.
yeah. I didn't even think about if I have finished compost and I don't need it. What am I going to do with it? Yeah, I don't want to keep it in the tumbler, because that's
What you can
always
do is just
be
make a
working.
pile, because you don't
Yeah.
need to turn it anymore. Make a pile of it somewhere, and then you can cover it, because you don't really want the sun hitting it. That can kind of, bleach out some of the nutrients. You don't want it to be
Mm-hmm.
rained on an excessive amount because that can wash away some of the compost, some of the nutrition. So yeah, in that case, I'd say just make a safe spot for it and cover it every time it rains.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I've got a little spot next to my barn that has a little roof, and I could put a
Nice.
tarp on top too. It'd be perfect.
Yeah, put it in a shady spot if you can find one. So all right,
Mm-hmm.
man. Well, I think we pretty much covered it all. I hope that made it easier for people to understand what your options are for composting, some advantages, some disadvantages to all of those options, So just so we say it out loud, there is a disadvantage to the tumbler, which we did mention, which is it's smaller, right? It's a smaller size for the
Mm-hmm.
normal price range. So that there is a disadvantage to that. But for most beginner gardeners that don't have, an entire facility or something, that would be something that I would recommend. So, all right, everybody, we hope that helped. We hope you enjoyed this one on composting. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us on our website, howtocultivate.com, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. So, hope you enjoyed episode 9. Come back for episode 10. Thank you, everyone.